The Christmas lights were still blinking when my father handed me a name tag in front of everyone. It swung from a cheap red lanyard and read, "Uncle Sam's Girl." People laughed, loud, comfortable. My sister smirked and said, "Food is for family." There was no chair for me at the table. So I calmly placed an envelope on the white linen, looked around the room and said 4 words that stopped every sound cold. Forks froze. Glasses hovered mid-air. No one laughed anymore. And that's when Christmas ended for my family. The dining room smelled like pine and cinnamon, and something expensive I couldn't name. My father's house always smelled like money at Christmas, real candles instead of battery ones, thick garlands wrapped tight around the staircase, a tree that had been professionally styled, as he liked to say, the kind of Christmas that looked good in photos and felt stiff when you stood too long in it. I stood just inside the doorway, my coat still on my boots, leaving faint damp prints on the polished wood floor. Snow had started falling on the drive outside, soft and quiet, the kind that usually made me nostalgic. That night, it just made me feel farther away. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 36 years old, and I serve in the United States Army. I hadn't worn my uniform that night. I'd learned years ago that wearing it around my family turned me into a prop, a conversation piece, something to point at when guests arrived. So I wore a simple dark sweater jeans, my hair pulled back clean and neat, still military, just without the costume they like to dress me in. My father clapped his hands together as I stepped in. "There she is," he said, voice bright, practiced. Everyone, Emily made it. A few heads turned, a few smiles. My sister Rachel didn't look up from her phone. Dad crossed the room toward me, holding something behind his back. I assumed it was a joke gift. He loved those something loud, something that got a reaction. He stopped right in front of me and brought his hand forward. It was a name tag. Plastic, red border, white center, block letters. Uncle Sam's Girl. For a half second my brain didn't process it. Then the room erupted. Laughter bounced off the high ceilings. Someone near the bar actually clapped. One of my uncles chuckled and said, "That's a good one, Frank." Dad grinned, proud. "Just a little Christmas humor," he said. "We don't want anyone forgetting who pays her salary." He clipped it onto my sweater himself, fingers quick, casual, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Rachel finally looked up. She glanced at the tag, then at me, and curled one side of her mouth into a smirk I knew too well. "Well," she said, nodding toward the table, "food is for family." More laughter, softer this time, but still there. I looked at the table. 12 place settings. Fine china with gold rims, linen napkins folded just so, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier, and 11 chairs. Not 12. There was no seat for me. I felt something shift in my chest, not a sharp pain, not anger, something colder, something settling into place. I scanned the room slowly. My mother wasn't there. She'd passed 3 years earlier, and sometimes I wondered if that was when all of this really started. My father's friends stood in clusters, wine glasses in hand. Rachel's husband leaned back in his chair, eyes on his phone, pretending not to notice. My aunt avoided my gaze entirely. No one said a word. I reached up and unclipped the name tag from my sweater. The plastic was warm from my body, light, insignificant. I turned it over once in my hand, then set it down on the sideboard. "I'll just put my things down," I said calmly. My voice sounded steady. That surprised me. I walked to the entryway and placed my coat over the banister. My movements were measured, deliberate, the way they are when you've been trained not to react until you understand the situation fully. When I turned back, Rachel had already taken my place in the flow of the room. She was laughing now, telling someone about the ski trip they were planning in January. Dad had moved on too, refilling drinks, telling another story about his golf club. I didn't exist anymore. I stepped toward the table anyway, stopping in the empty space where my chair should have been. I could feel the absence like a physical thing, the gap, the message. That's when I reached into my bag. The envelope was thick, manila, unmarked. I'd carried it the entire drive over, resting on the passenger seat like a quiet promise. I hadn't planned on using it that night, not originally. But some lines once crossed don't get uncrossed. I placed the envelope gently on the table directly in front of my father's plate. The sound it made against the china wasn't loud, but it cut through the room anyway. Conversations faltered. Someone cleared their throat. The music from the speakers seemed suddenly too loud. Dad frowned. "What's that?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at him, really looked. At the man who'd raised me to believe in hard work and standing your ground and not letting anyone talk down to you. At the man who'd taught me how to change a tire, how to throw a punch if I had to, how to be tough in a world that didn't make space for softness. At the man who now thought my service was a punchline. Then I spoke. "You just lost everything." 4 words. That's all it took. The room went silent. Rachel let out a short, nervous laugh. "Oh my God, Emily, don't be so dramatic. It's a joke." My father stared at the envelope, then back up at me. "What are you talking about?" I reached for the name tag on the sideboard, picked it up, and set it neatly on top of the envelope. "I won't be staying for dinner," I said. "Merry Christmas." For a moment, no one moved. No one stopped me. No one said my name. I turned and walked out past the tree, past the carefully wrapped gifts that suddenly meant nothing, past the family photos on the wall that hadn't included me in years anyway. The cold night air hit my face as soon as the door closed behind me, sharp, clean, honest. My phone buzzed in my pocket before I reached my car. I didn't look. As I pulled out of the driveway, the house glowed behind me, warm and perfect and full of people who thought they'd just had a good laugh. They had no idea what was in that envelope. And they had no idea what was coming next. I drove for a long time without a destination, the Christmas lights blurring into streaks of red and white as the snow picked up. My phone buzzed again, then again. Rachel, Dad. Rachel again. I flipped it face down on the passenger seat and focused on the road. People like to think moments like that happen all at once, that you walk into a room, get humiliated, and suddenly decide to burn everything down. But the truth is quieter. Slower. What happened at that table wasn't the beginning. It was the moment I finally stopped pretending. I pulled into a diner off the highway, the kind with fluorescent lights and a faded sign that promised hot coffee like it was a sacred oath. Inside, it smelled like grease and sugar and old vinyl. A woman about my mother's age poured me coffee without asking questions. I wrapped my hands around the mug and let the warmth sink in. I thought about how I'd ended up here. I grew up in my father's house believing 2 things mattered above all else: loyalty and appearances. Dad was the kind of man who stood for the anthem with his hand over his heart and complained loudly about kids these days, while making sure the neighbors noticed his flagpole. He talked about service the way some men talk about God, reverent in theory, controlling in practice. When I told him I was enlisting, he didn't yell, he didn't forbid it, he just went quiet. "You don't have to do that," he said finally. "We can help you get into a good school. Rachel's doing fine without all this drama." Drama. That was the word he used, as if choosing my own path was a tantrum. I enlisted anyway, not to rebel, not to prove a point. I enlisted because I wanted something that belonged to me, because I wanted to earn my place instead of inheriting it. Because after Mom died, the house felt smaller and I needed to breathe. At first, Dad bragged. To the right people. To the ones who nodded approvingly and said things like, "Well, that's impressive," or "good for her." Around them, I was his daughter in uniform, proof that he'd raised someone disciplined and patriotic. In private, it was different. He called me government property, asked if I'd learned how to follow orders yet. Every conversation circled back to what I owed him, the family, the name. Rachel played along, rolling her eyes when I talked about training, smirking when I mentioned long nights or missed holidays. "You chose that life," she'd say. "Don't act like a martyr." Somewhere along the way, my service stopped being something they respected and became something they felt entitled to use. I stirred my coffee and stared out the diner window as a plow rumbled past. I thought about the past year in particular, how Dad had started asking more questions, detailed ones. So, who handles your money when you're deployed? Who's listed if something happens to you? Your credit's probably great, right? With all those benefits. He said it casually, like he was just curious, like a father looking out for his daughter. Rachel was less subtle. "You should really put Dad down as your emergency contact," she'd said once, scrolling through her phone. "It would just make things easier, especially if you're overseas." Easier for who? I'd brushed it off at first, told myself I was being sensitive, that families asked questions, that not everything was a threat. But then came the paperwork. Dad had emailed me a few documents to look over. Forms half filled, my name already typed in signature lines highlighted. It was nothing official, he said. Just contingency planning, estate stuff, smart adult things. I didn't sign. That was when the tone shifted. Rachel stopped inviting me to things unless Dad was present. Conversations grew clipped, jokes sharpened. I started to feel like a guest in my own family welcome only if I played the role they'd assigned me. Uncle Sam's girl. The waitress refilled my cup. "You okay, hon?" she asked softly. "Yeah," I said after a moment, "I will be." When I left the diner, I didn't go back to base housing or a friend's place. I checked into a small motel on the edge of town, paid cash, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the envelope I'd finally pulled from my bag. Inside were copies, notices, revocations, a paper trail I'd hoped I wouldn't need. I'd started putting it together weeks earlier after a conversation that wouldn't leave me alone. Rachel had called voice bright too bright. "Dad's worried about you," she'd said, "about how much you're carrying on your own. He thinks maybe it would be good if someone helped manage things. You know, just in case." In case of what I'd asked. There was a pause, just long enough. "You're in the military," she said. "Anything could happen." That night I'd made my first appointment with a lawyer. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted clarity. The lawyer was calm, methodical. She explained what I already suspected, that my finances were mine. My decisions protected my signature, the only thing that could give them access. She also explained how easily pressure and family concern could be used to muddy that line. "So what do you want to do?" she'd asked. I'd thought about my father's questions, Rachel's smirk, the way my name had started showing up on documents I hadn't approved. "I want to make sure no one can speak for me," I'd said, "ever." She'd nodded. "Then we'll make that very clear." I lay back on the motel bed, the heater rattling softly, and thought about the look on my father's face when I placed the envelope on the table. The confusion, the sudden loss of control. They thought the name tag was the insult. They didn't realize the real one was still sealed. Outside snow tapped against the window like quiet punctuation. Tomorrow they would open the envelope. And nothing would be the same again. Morning came slowly, the kind of gray winter morning that doesn't announce itself so much as creep in around the edges. I woke up in the motel bed with my boots still by the door, and my phone dark on the nightstand. For a few seconds I didn't remember where I was. Then the memory of the name tag, the laughter, the empty chair came back all at once, sharp and unmistakable. I sat up and rubbed my face, feeling the ache in my shoulders that never quite went away. Years of carrying gear tension responsibility. I reached for my phone and turned it on. 23 missed calls, 14 messages. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I showered, dressed, and packed my bag with the kind of efficiency that comes from habit. The envelope stayed exactly where it was, tucked flat and protected. I wasn't angry, not the way people expect. I felt focused, clear. That clarity hadn't come overnight. It had been building for months. The truth was, my family had been turning me into a symbol long before they ever handed me that tag. Uncle Sam's girl wasn't a joke pulled out of thin air. It was a label they'd been using quietly, conveniently, whenever it suited them. At neighborhood barbecues, Dad would clap me on the shoulder and say, "She's our government girl," like I was an investment he'd made that paid dividends in social currency. When people asked what I did, he'd answer for me, embellishing just enough to make it impressive without ever asking if he'd gotten it right. Rachel leaned into it even harder. "You know, Emily gets all those benefits," she'd tell friends. "Healthcare, housing, the works. Must be nice having Uncle Sam take care of you." She never said it with admiration, always with that edge, like my independence was cheating. What they didn't see, or chose not to, were the missed birthdays, the holidays spent in different time zones, the quiet nights when the weight of everything settled in, and there was no one to hand it off to. Service was something they liked to display, not understand. About 2 months before Christmas, Dad had invited me over for dinner. Just him and Rachel, no guests, no performance. I'd hoped it meant something had softened. Halfway through the meal, he'd leaned back in his chair and said, "I've been thinking about how scattered everything is. Your accounts, your paperwork. If something happened, it would be a mess." Rachel nodded along. "It's just practical," she said. "We're family. We should help each other." I'd felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Help how I'd asked. Dad waved a hand. Nothing dramatic, just access, so we can step in if needed. Step in where I pressed. Another pause, another glance between them. That's when I knew I realized later. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about control. After that dinner, the comments got sharper. Rachel started joking about how I worked for the government like it meant I didn't understand money. Dad began forwarding me articles about soldiers who lost everything because they didn't plan ahead. Then there were the forms. I found one printed and sitting on my old desk the next time I visited a draft power of attorney, my name typed neatly at the top signature line waiting at the bottom. No explanation, no conversation. I confronted Rachel first. "What is this?" I asked, holding the paper out. She shrugged. "Dad thought it might be smart. You know, just in case you're unreachable." "I'm not unreachable," I said. "I'm an adult." She smiled thinly. "You're also single, and gone a lot." That was the moment I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. I started paying closer attention, noticing things I'd brushed aside before, the way Dad asked for copies of my documents, the way Rachel asked for details about my deployments, my benefits, my savings, the way conversations always seemed to circle back to what I had and how complicated it all must be. One afternoon I arrived early to pick something up from Dad's house and heard voices in the kitchen before I reached the doorway. I wasn't trying to listen. I froze because my name came up. "She won't say no," Rachel was saying. "She's trained to follow orders." Dad chuckled. "She's tough, but she's still my kid." "She'll sign," Rachel continued. "She won't want to look ungrateful." I stepped back quietly and left without saying a word. That night I sat alone in my apartment and opened my laptop. I searched for attorneys who specialized in estate planning and financial autonomy. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't threaten. I didn't ask permission. I prepared. The lawyer I chose didn't rush me. She listened as I explained the family dynamics, the subtle pressure, the paperwork appearing without consent. "You're not imagining this," she said finally. "This happens more often than people admit, especially when family members think they know what's best for you." She laid out my options: revocations, notices, boundaries clearly defined and legally enforced. "Once these are in place," she said, "no one can act on your behalf without your explicit approval." I signed, I documented, I secured everything. And then I waited. Christmas came wrapped in lights and laughter and one final test of how small they thought I would make myself. Standing there in that dining room name tag dangling chair missing, I realized something else too. They hadn't just been planning to manage my affairs. They'd been planning to manage me. To keep me useful when convenient and invisible when not, to dress my service up as patriotism while stripping it of dignity. The envelope on the table wasn't revenge, it was a line. As I checked out of the motel later that morning, my phone buzzed again. This time I looked. A message from Dad, short, sharp. "What did you give us last night?" I typed back just 4 words. "You'll find out." Then I drove toward the law office, the winter sun breaking weakly through the clouds, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. The law office sat between a dry cleaner and a bakery that smelled like sugar even through the cold. It wasn't impressive. No marble floors, no sweeping lobby, just a small brass plaque by the door and a waiting room with chairs that had been reupholstered more than once. I liked that. It felt real, solid, the kind of place where things were done carefully and quietly. I arrived early and sat with my hands folded in my lap watching the second hand on the clock crawl forward. When my name was called, I followed the receptionist down a short hallway into an office lined with bookshelves and framed certificates. My attorney Laura Whitman stood to greet me. She was in her late 50s, gray threaded through her dark hair glasses perched low on her nose. She didn't smile too quickly or speak too loudly. She had the calm of someone who'd seen families tear themselves apart over far less. "You came prepared," she said as I set my folder on her desk. "I had to," I replied. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing everything again. Accounts, beneficiaries, powers of attorney that had been drafted but never signed, emails, messages, the paper trail of pressure disguised as concern. Laura leaned back in her chair when we finished. "You understand," she said, "that what they were attempting wasn't illegal yet. Not until you signed." "I know," I said. "That's why I didn't." She nodded. What you've done now makes your position very clear. No ambiguity, no access, no room for interpretation. I thought about the envelope sitting on my father's table unopened or maybe already torn into by curious hands. What happens next, I asked. That depends on how they react, she said. But legally, you're protected. Everything in that envelope is enforceable, immediate. They can argue, they can guilt you, but they can't undo it. I thanked her and stood feeling lighter than I had walking in. Outside, the sky had cleared just enough for sunlight to reflect off the snow, turning everything painfully bright. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, letting myself breathe. The drive back toward town was quiet. My phone rang twice. I ignored it. By the time I reached the motel, there was a message waiting from Rachel. "Are you serious?" I didn't respond. An hour later, another message came through, from Dad. "We need to talk, now." I stared at the screen, then set the phone down and went to make myself coffee with the tiny motel machine. The coffee was weak and tasted like burnt plastic. I drank it anyway. I knew exactly what was happening back at the house. Dad would have opened the envelope first, impatience getting the better of him. Rachel would have hovered close, reading over his shoulder. They would have laughed at first, assuming it was a dramatic gesture, a bluff. Then they would have read the words they weren't expecting. Notice of revocation. Termination of any implied authority. Cease and desist regarding use of name, likeness, or financial information. Formal acknowledgement of sole control over assets and decisions. There was also a copy of the unsigned power of attorney they'd left on my desk weeks earlier, attached as an exhibit. Proof. I imagined the silence that followed, the shift, the realization that they had miscalculated. My phone rang again. This time I answered. "What the hell is this?" Rachel demanded without preamble. "It's exactly what it says," I replied calmly. "You can't do this," she said. "We're your family." "Family doesn't require legal access," I said. "Respect does." Dad's voice cut in louder, angrier. "You embarrassed us last night, in front of everyone." I leaned back against the bed and closed my eyes. "You embarrassed yourselves." "You think this is funny?" he snapped. "Pulling some legal stunt because of a joke." "It wasn't a joke," I said, "and it wasn't sudden." Rachel scoffed. "You're overreacting. You always do, this whole tough soldier thing." "Stop," I said, my voice low but firm. "This conversation is over." "You don't get to decide that," Dad barked. I just did. I hung up before either of them could respond. The next day was worse. Calls, messages, voicemails that swung wildly between anger and pleading. Rachel accused me of betraying the family. Dad accused me of being ungrateful. Then when that didn't work, they tried something else. Concern. A voicemail from Dad, softer this time. "We're worried about you, Em. This doesn't sound like you. Maybe you should talk to someone." I deleted it. That afternoon they showed up at the motel. I watched from behind the curtain as Dad's car pulled into the lot, Rachel's SUV right behind it. My heart rate spiked, but my resolve didn't waver. They knocked hard, too hard. I opened the door just enough to see them, clearly chain still latched. "We need to talk," Dad said, trying to step forward. "No," I replied. "You need to leave." Rachel's face flushed. "You can't just shut us out." "I can," I said, "and I am." Dad's jaw tightened. "After everything we've done for you." I met his gaze. "This is about what you tried to take." Silence stretched between us. Rachel glanced around the parking lot, then back at me. "You really think you're better than us now?" "No," I said. "I think I finally stopped letting you treat me like less." Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. For a moment I saw something flicker there, confusion, maybe even fear. The realization that the dynamic he'd relied on his whole life no longer existed. "Leave," I said again. They did. Not gracefully, not quietly, but they left. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against it, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That night I lay awake listening to cars pass on the highway outside. The envelope was no longer just a threat or a symbol. It was a boundary. And for the first time, it was holding. The morning after my father and Rachel showed up at the motel, I woke before the alarm. My body was used to it, years of early formations and disrupted sleep. But this time it wasn't duty that pulled me out of bed. It was a strange, unfamiliar quiet inside my chest. Not relief, not victory. Space. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the heater kick on and off, and realized something important had already happened. For the first time in my adult life, my family no longer had access to me by default. Not my time, not my energy, not my decisions. That had always been the unspoken rule. They could demand and I would respond. They could push and I would adjust. They could joke at my expense and I would swallow it to keep the peace. That rule was gone. I dressed slowly and drove back toward town, not to the house, not to the diner, but to a bank branch I'd never used before. It was small, quiet, tucked between a pharmacy and a nail salon. The kind of place where no one knew my last name. I opened a new account, transferred funds, changed alerts, locked down access. The woman helping me smiled, politely asked routine questions, slid papers across the desk. To her it was just another Tuesday. To me it felt like reclaiming ground inch by inch. By noon my phone rang again. This time it was my Aunt Linda. "Emily," she said gently, "your dad's beside himself. He says you're cutting everyone out." "I'm setting boundaries," I replied. There was a pause. "He's your father." "And I'm his daughter," I said. That didn't stop him. Linda sighed. "People are talking." "I know." "What's in that envelope?" she asked carefully. I looked out the windshield at a line of bare trees, their branches black against the winter sky. "The truth," I said. That afternoon I met Laura again. Not because I had to, everything was already filed, but because I wanted to be sure. Sure that there were no loose ends. Sure that what I'd done would hold up under pressure. She reviewed the additional steps I'd taken and nodded approvingly. "You've covered yourself well," she said. "If they try to push, intimidate, or misrepresent anything, call me." "They'll try," I said. "They always do," she replied. As I left her office, my phone buzzed with a new message. From Rachel. "You've made this impossible. Dad is humiliated." I typed back slowly. "Humiliation comes from actions, not consequences." A minute later, 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. "You think you're so strong because you wear a uniform." I stared at the words longer than I needed to. "I'm strong because I finally stopped explaining myself," I wrote back. I blocked her number. That night I didn't go back to the motel. I drove farther north to a small rental I'd already arranged weeks earlier. 1 bedroom, plain furniture, a view of a frozen lake and nothing else. No memories attached to it yet, no expectations. I carried my bag inside, set it down, and stood in the quiet. It felt empty, but not lonely. 2 days later, the backlash hit full force. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly cared deeply about family unity. Old friends of my father's sent messages full of disappointment and concern. One even suggested I might be going through something and should consider getting help. I read them all. I didn't answer. Then came the certified letter. Dad had hired his own attorney. The letter was stiff, formal, and carefully worded. It suggested mediation. It implied confusion. It hinted that I might not have been in the best state of mind at Christmas. Laura read it and smiled thinly. "They're fishing," she said, "and they're late." "Do I need to respond?" I asked. "No," she said. "Silence is a response." So I stayed silent. On the 5th day after Christmas, my father finally called from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Emily," he said quietly, "this has gone too far." I leaned against the kitchen counter, the lake outside perfectly still. "You crossed that line," I said. "I just stopped pretending you hadn't." "You're punishing us," he insisted. "No," I replied, "I'm protecting myself." "You don't have to do this alone," he said. I thought of the chair that hadn't been there, the laughter, the name tag. "I already was," I said, and hung up. That night, I took the envelope, now empty, its job done, and placed it in a drawer. I didn't need it anymore. What it represented was already in effect. They no longer decided who I was. They no longer defined my worth. And they no longer had a seat at the table unless they learned how to respect the one I'd claimed for myself. By the 2nd week of January, the noise started to die down. Not because anyone had suddenly understood me, but because they were running out of moves. I noticed it first in the silence. Fewer calls from unknown numbers. Fewer carefully worded messages from relatives who just wanted to check in. The panic had burned hot and fast, and now it was cooling into something else, resentment maybe, or acceptance. With my family, it was often hard to tell the difference. I had settled into the rental by the lake. The mornings were quiet there, broken only by the sound of ice shifting far out on the water and the low hum of a distant road. I drank my coffee by the window and watched the sky change colors, feeling more grounded than I had in years. Then my father showed up again. This time he came alone. I saw his car from inside pulling into the narrow drive like it didn't quite belong there. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment before getting out his shoulders, hunched against the cold. He looked older than I remembered, smaller. I didn't open the door right away. When I finally did, I stayed inside the threshold, arms crossed loosely, not defensive, just firm. "What do you want?" I asked. He looked past me into the house, taking in the sparse furniture, the lack of decoration. "This is where you're staying?" "Yes." "You didn't have to leave," he said. "You could have come home." I felt a flicker of something at the word home. I let it pass. "You made it clear there wasn't a place for me," I said. He exhaled slowly. "That wasn't my intention." "It was the result," I replied. We stood there in silence. The wind cut across the frozen lake, sharp and clean. "I don't understand why you had to make it legal," he said finally. "Why you had to involve lawyers." I studied his face, searching for the man I used to trust. "Because you didn't hear me when I spoke," I said. "You only paid attention when it affected your control." His jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "I didn't get a chair," I said quietly. "That was fair." He looked away. For a moment I thought he might apologize. I really did. His mouth opened slightly as if he were reaching for the words. Instead he said, "Rachel's been taking this hard." Of course she was. "I didn't do this to hurt her," I said. "I did it because she helped you plan it." She was trying to protect the family, he insisted. "By deciding my life for me?" "She was worried," he said. "We both were." I shook my head. "You were worried about losing access." That landed. His shoulders slumped just a fraction. "I just wanted to make sure things were handled properly." "You wanted to handle me," I said. "There's a difference." He rubbed his hands together the way he used to when he was frustrated. "So what now?" he asked. "Are you cutting us off forever?" I thought about the question carefully. "No," I said, "but I'm not going back to how it was." He nodded slowly as if considering terms he didn't like. "Your mother wouldn't have wanted this." That one stung. He knew it would. I straightened. "Don't use her," I said, my voice steady but cold. "She taught me to stand up for myself. You taught me to look strong in public and weak in private." His eyes snapped up to mine. "That's not true," he said. "It is," I replied, "and you know it." Another silence stretched between us, longer this time. "What would it take," he asked finally, "to fix this?" I let the question hang for a moment, then answered honestly. "Accountability," I said. "A real apology. Not for embarrassing me, not for overstepping, for disrespecting me, for treating my service like a joke and my autonomy like a convenience." He swallowed. "And Rachel?" "She owes me one too," I said. "And until I hear it, nothing changes." He nodded again, slower this time. "I don't know if she'll see it that way." "Then that's her choice," I said, "just like this was yours." He looked at the lake again, then back at me. "You've changed." I considered that. "No," I said. I stopped shrinking. He didn't have a response to that. When he finally turned to leave, he hesitated. "You're still my daughter." I met his eyes, then "Treat me like one." He drove away without another word. That night my phone buzzed with a new message. "Rachel." I almost didn't open it. "Dad told me what you said," she wrote. "I still think you went too far, but I didn't think you'd actually walk away." I read the message twice. "I didn't think you'd make me choose," she added. I typed back slowly. "I didn't choose this, I chose myself." I didn't block her, not yet. I set the phone down and stepped outside onto the small porch. The air was bitter cold, but the sky was clear, stars sharp and bright overhead. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and breathed deeply. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for the next confrontation. Whatever came next would be on my terms. By the time February arrived, the lake began to change. The ice didn't break all at once. It softened first, cracked in thin spiderweb lines that spread quietly beneath the surface. Every morning I watched it from the kitchen window, coffee warming my hands, and thought about how much strength it took to let go without shattering. That was how my life felt now, different, thinner in some places, stronger in others. I hadn't heard from Rachel in weeks, not since her last message heavy with resentment and something close to fear. My father called once, left a voicemail that stayed carefully on the surface. No accusations, no apologies either. Just an update about a neighbor I barely remembered and a comment about the weather. I didn't call back. Instead, I built routines that belonged to me. I ran along the frozen shoreline in the mornings, boots crunching on snow breath, steady and controlled. I cooked simple meals at night, the kind that didn't require coordination or performance. I slept deeply. When I dreamed, it wasn't of empty chairs or laughter behind my back. It was of open roads and quiet spaces. One afternoon, I drove into town to pick up groceries and ran into Mrs. Hargreave, an older woman who lived 2 doors down. She smiled when she saw me, eyes crinkling. "You're the soldier," she said kindly. I waited for the edge. It didn't come. "My husband served," she continued. "People like to talk about service. Fewer like to respect it." I smiled back. "That's been my experience, too." She patted my arm. "You look lighter," she said. "Whatever you did, keep doing it." Those words stayed with me. Late one evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, my phone rang again. This time it was Rachel. I answered. "I'm not apologizing," she said immediately, voice tight. "Not for everything." I leaned against the counter and listened. "But," she continued, "I keep replaying that night, and I can't stop thinking about how no one stood up for you." I said nothing. "I didn't think you'd leave," she admitted. "I thought you'd roll your eyes and let it go. Like always." "That's the problem," I said quietly. There was a long pause. "Dad's angry," she said. "He says you're punishing us." "I'm not," I replied. "I'm protecting myself." "You really won't come back?" she asked. I thought about the question carefully. About the house full of people who laughed. About the table with no seat. About the name tag swinging from a red lanyard like a brand. "I won't go where I'm diminished," I said. "If that place ever changes, we can talk." She exhaled sharply. "You've changed." I smiled even though she couldn't see it. No, I just stopped negotiating my worth. She didn't have a response for that. We hung up without a resolution, and for the first time that didn't feel like failure. It felt like honesty. On a quiet Sunday morning, not long after I took the name tag out of the drawer where I'd put it weeks earlier, I turned it over in my hands, tracing the letters with my thumb. Uncle Sam's girl. I thought about everything that phrase had been meant to do, to shrink me, to turn my service into a joke, to remind me that no matter what I'd earned, I was still supposed to fall back into line. I walked outside and dropped it into the lake. It disappeared with a soft sound, barely a ripple. That afternoon I set my table for one. A simple wooden table, slightly uneven, picked up secondhand. I placed a plate in the center, a glass of water, a chair pulled out exactly where it belonged. And I sat. Not because I was alone, but because I was no longer waiting for permission to take my place. If you're listening to this and you've ever been laughed at in a room you helped build, if you've ever been labeled instead of respected, if you've ever stood while everyone else sat and wondered when it became acceptable, hear this clearly. You don't owe your dignity to anyone, not your family, not your history, not your silence. And when someone hands you a name instead of a seat, you are allowed to walk away. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from, or what part of this story felt familiar. We share these stories because you're not alone, and because reclaiming your place is always worth it. There are many more stories like this about people who finally chose themselves after being told to stay small. So, if you'd like to continue this journey with us, please subscribe and join our community. Thank you for listening. And remember, you deserve a seat at your own table.